was working up in Sydney as the national ambassador for Johnny Walker and the Classic Malts, which is a great gig, by the way. That was a lot of fun. I love my wife. I really did. That was a difficult choice when I had to pull up stumps and basically hand in my resignation for that particular role to come down here and start afresh. My wife is from Adelaide, and I guess it was always on the cards to move back here. Italian family, she wanted to be around that. And I was like, sweet, no problem, I can do that. What am I going to do in Adelaide? What is it? What part of my role am I going to revisit? And I started a little distillery with a couple of friends of mine. We're about to go on board with BWS, which is very, very exciting. So I'm one of 3 owners of Never Never Distilling Co. So I'm not sure if you've heard of Never Never. Hopefully you will over the coming months, years, decades, come on. So that's pretty much me. Why I'm here tonight is because I'm still broke. I started a distillery. That's what you do when you push all of your chips into the middle of a table and you have a crack at, I guess, what your passion is. Prior to this, obviously, I had a great experience with whiskey. We're going to start making whiskey at the distillery as well. So it's a really great opportunity. If anyone here is really interested in production, like the nuts and bolts of production, it's a small setup, but at the same time, if it's something that you're interested in, by all means, come and get my details at the end of the night, and I'll be more than happy to give you a card and take you around the distillery itself. This is probably the first time I've been in a jacket for about 6 months. Everything else has been, singlets and, well, not anymore, but certainly long sleeves, flannels and everything else. So it's been a bit of an interesting ride. When it comes to whiskey, who in the room would consider themselves potentially sort of like an amateur at best? Yeah, cool. What about a medium level? Kind of got their favourites, know a little bit about maybe Scotch or maybe Irish or maybe Australian, but not much else, somewhere in the middle. All right, who are my Jedis in the room? Who are the people that just, come on, there's got to be a 1 or 2. Really? Simon's not here. Oh, I'm surprised by that. Usually there's always someone like, I want to teach you something, which is great. And that, to be honest, that's what the majority of your customers a lot of the time think that they are when they step in front of you. Those can sometimes be the most difficult customers to deal with, people that have a plethora of information that they're laying down on you, and you're kind of stumbling your way through to understand exactly what this person wants, who's clearly very educated. I'm going to try and give you a few little tips and techniques, give you a little bit of understanding about my experience with whiskey, and in particular, my experience in retail, in the way that you guys have been, you have to step in front of customers and give them the experience that they need. I guess it all comes down to that word, experience. That's all customers are really after. That's all people who love whiskey are really after, a really nice whiskey experience. Very, very few are sitting down, nose in glasses, taking tasting notes. Very, very few are that top level kind of super serious nerd, whiskey club kind of drinker, and they do exist, but not everyone's that. For me, what got me into whiskey, what I love about whiskey, especially good whiskey, is that they're little punctuation marks, in your night out, in your evening. They're things that you can remember. They're things that you enjoy. They're things that you love. They might be something at the beginning of a meal, something light, an aperitif like. You maybe had it with a beer, watching the footy. There's something that you might sort of have on the sly. Like me, I drink very little whiskey these days. I mainly drink gin because that's what we're making, but I still like to have my little moment. Mainly when my wife goes to bed. That's because she hates the whiskies that I like because it stinks. And she's just like, right, that's my sign to leave you to it. And that's when I get into Talisker with a box of Maltesers. And I watch the movies that she can't watch, like Game of Thrones. Can't stand it, I love it. That's my time. And there's a lot of people like that have their little moment, their little experience. I'm trying to give you a few little ideas, a few little experiences that you can take out to your customers. Take to yourself, enjoy yourself at home as well. Because after all, that's really what the joy of whiskey is. I'm going to give you information. I'm going to give you lots of histories, all sorts of different bits and pieces which you may or may not wish to use. But the main thing, the most important thing that we'll talk about tonight is how you can communicate those experiences to your customers. That's Pure and simple. That's what's going to sell booze. That's what's going to make the difference between someone standing next to you and you talking them through something on the shelf. And that's kind of why we're here, yeah? That's what you want to sort of walk away with. Now, I'm not going to get into the history. I'll give you a little bit of history because I love it. Who's any history buffs in the room? Yes. I relax with, yeah. Ask me anything about sharks and Nazis. I am literally the National Geographic Channel. That's pretty much all of Nazi megastructures. I'm done for an hour. That's me. You know, I love that kind of stuff. And I love the histories that are associated to all of this. But for a reason. I love understanding the history about whiskey because it gives you a really good idea about why they taste the way they taste. It's not just all sort of, you know, autobiographical, let's not do that word. It's not all just histories about the owners. It's not all the histories about, you know, the founders. You know, there's really, really interesting histories that are associated to, you know, why they use the ingredients that they use in order to make the stuff that they make. When we get into Canadian whiskey, that's a great example. Getting understanding about the points of differences between all the global whiskies. You know, it comes down to that very simple point. As we go through, please hit me up with any questions. I'd love to make this as informal as possible. We've got cheese and chocolate and pretzels and great whiskey. There's spittoons in the middle of the table. We're all going to be using the same glass, not all sharing one glass, the one that's in front of you. So please make sure that once you finish it, like if you're spitting tonight and you're driving, please sip it out. There's 10 mils each. We've got 5, so 50 mils, so just under 2 standard drinks. So just if you are driving, you should be okay if you're on your opens, but just be mindful, obviously. You know, it is straight spirit. But please hit me up. There's a few little, if you like water in your whiskey, there's obviously a few people in the room that might enjoy that. There's a few little dropper bottles there. Please jump up and grab one if you like. It does do an interesting thing of opening up your whiskey slightly, especially if you're a bit of an amateur, especially if you're not used to drinking straight spirits. That's pretty important. But again, please stop me as I go through. Did I say my name? Sorry, I'm Sean. My name's Sean Baxter. Awesome, guys. Let's get into, I guess, the beginnings of Scotch whiskey, because that's kind of where, you know, well, we're not drinking Irish whiskey tonight. The Irish pretty much kicked it off. Any Scots in the room? Yep, sorry about that. That's just really is the way it is. I've done that in front of rooms of Scots, and it started fist fights. So it is one of those things that is a little bit scary to say that out loud. But that's effectively where when we look at the beginnings of whiskey, Iskabaha, the water of life. It was created by monks. Okay, they had pinched the knowledge of Arab alchemists back during the Crusades. This is where we get the whole idea of these alembic stills and alcohol. It's all Arabic terminology that's been borrowed, you know, by those, you know, missionaries, crusaders, when they were picking up and looting and pillaging and all the different things that they did when they were bringing back all those interesting technologies back to the UK, back to Ireland. It was studied by priests because ultimately this whole concept of fermentation, the beginnings of what you require to make a whiskey, were quite miraculous. No one really understood what the hell was going on. Today we kind of do. Today we've got a better idea about what's happening when I say fermentation. Roughly. We've all kind of passed science. No, but still, roughly. You know that yeast comes down and feeds on the sugars that are available in barley or wheat or corn or grapes, you know, whatever it is that you're distilling. The process of that feeding frenzy, okay, is alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is the crux of how we make alcohol. You know, back in those days, what they would do is they'd take some wheat, okay, they'd add some water, they'd leave it in a field. 3 days later, it was alcoholic. Thank you very much. I'll pray to whoever did that. And this is why we had gods of beer and wine and good times with the Greek and Romans. It's no different with the Catholics and the Christians. Okay, what they were studying, what these alchemists were studying, it was what this Iskabaha was some form of miracle. And when they took this beer, which is what it was, and put it through one of these, a pot still, to focus that flavour, the spiritus that came out the other side was equally as magical. This is why people call it the water of life. This is why Scots crack the shits when you put Coke with it. Because it's a miracle. And it truly was life-giving. We talk about this sort of the water of life. It truly was life-giving. Back in the William Wallace days, back in the 1300s, 1400s, early 1400s, bit after William Wallace, but anyway, you know what I mean. Fighting against the English, fighting against themselves. If you copped an arrow through the leg, you were pretty much dead. You wouldn't die on the battlefield, but you die maybe 3-4 weeks later from infection, from blood disease. That's because their idea of medicine was like rubbing raw cow's milk into the wound, because cow's milk obviously stimulates muscle growth. We also know that cow's milk is full of bacteria. What does it create? Infection. Leg falls off. Not a great cure. Suddenly one bright spark started washing the wound with this magical iskabaha, the water of life. And what happens? Gets better. Fights off the bacteria. Saves the person's life. They even started actually resting the implements, the medical tools that they'd use to sew up the wounds with this stuff. Of course, sterilisation. This is why it's such an important part of not only Scottish culture, Irish culture, but across the world. That's why I get so into it. I'll pass this around, by the way. This is actually unaged whiskey. This is whiskey straight from the still. Okay, this is stuff that basically still smells like what it's made from, which is grass. What I'm going to be talking to you today is about how flavour gets into these whiskies. Why they taste different from one another. Because that's what you really need. When someone's standing in front of you going, I've got no idea about whiskey, why is that different to that? A lot of the time when you say, oh, well, it's a Highland style, or it's a Lowland style, or it's all these different kind of elements, they will just go straight over their head. If you go, they use peat on the grain, that makes it smoky. Job done. All right, thanks very much. Much, much easier to understand. So I'll talk a little bit about production just so you grasp that understanding. I'll pass this around. This is a little bit of that spirit. Don't drink it. It's about 65 proof. We'll send you blind. Seriously? Don't drink it. So, very, very quickly, to get an understanding of single malt whiskey, which is, I guess, the crux of Scotch. You start off with malted barley. Okay? I'll pass around a little bit of this as I talk about it. Sorry I don't have enough to have in front of all of you, but it'll get to you eventually. Now, the reason why you need to malt barley is to access all these different sugars that exist in that particular grain. Through that process of malting, you change the flavours that are available in that particular little grain. You can use unmalted barley to make whiskies. It's happened all across the world. Happens at Canadian whiskies with Crown Royal, which we're going to taste a bit later on. Happens with vodkas. You can still make spirit with non-malted grain, but it has a completely different flavour. It's also much more it's also quite expensive to go through that malting process. There's a lot of rigorous time and effort. So all this drives up the price point, and you end up with quite a premium product at the end of the day. Now, when it comes to flavour and how you can get flavour into that barley, this is unmalted. Pass it around. What you first have to do, okay, is dry that grain out. You wet it. By wetting it, it activates the little the grass inside of it. A little tiny microspire pops out of the husk. Okay, and that's basically breaking down those complex sugars that exist in that grain. That's what we need. We're making a beer, effectively. Okay, it's not going to have hops and all those other particular flavours, but every distiller has a brewer, and it's his job to begin this process, to start the malting process. Now, this is an important place where flavour is injected. Now, if you're a Highland style, usually, or a Lowland style, okay, what you'll do is dry it off with hot air. Irish whiskey does exactly the same thing, dries it off with hot air. Very, very little smoke, very, very little kind of peated flavours. In the islands, I've got to be really careful with this because I've lit this before and I've set off a fire alarm. So, let's just roll the dice, shall we? I like to live on the edge. It's far less scary than doing it at the Randwick Racecourse where I cleared out a whole area. That was very, very not my finest work. So this is basically peat. Peat's dug out of the ground in Scotland. It's effectively like a brown coal. It's just full of vegetation, full of different kind of elements that, you could pass it around actually, yeah. Full of various vegetation that falls down into bog marshes, can't decompose, so it's left there as a vegetal state. It's cut out. When it's dried, it's very, very vibrant. It has a lot of interesting flavours depending on which part of the country you cut it out from. Now that is how they would dry off their peat, dry off their grain throughout the entirety of their Scottish heritage. Nearly all Scottish whisky at some stage would have been peated. It would have had that intensity, had that richness. As technologies changed and as tastes changed, suddenly we have this explosion of different styles and different varieties. Okay? Now on your mainland, it's mainly all non-peated. There's a few that buck the trend, and there's more and more, to be honest, as people sort of get on board with peat. But the majority of your Highland distilleries don't use it. Same with your lowland. That's because they updated. They didn't need to use this quite antiquated form, of drying off peat. They started using steam. They started using gas. They upgraded. And that's an example of where history's changed flavour. Your islands, because they're isolated, because they're really difficult to get to, stayed the same. Because why bother changing it? And this is why everything in Islay and everything in Orkney and everything in Skye has big, big flavours. Just still have a bit of that smoke, still has a bit of that intensity. So they'll dry it off, and that's where you get peated malt. That's where you get your Lagavulins and your Taliskers, your Lafroigs, your Ardbegs. We've all heard of those brands, yeah? Again, that's where you get that intensity. When I'm standing in front of a customer and I know that they want a single malt, the first thing I say is, do you like smoke or do you hate smoke? Because then you diverge. Then you change up the way that you talk to them. There's no point if they're buying for a guest, I never ever really go to smoke because it's too much of a coin toss. Most people will love a great Highland whisky. It might not be their favourite, but most people will love it if they're given a bottle of it. They might even swap it for something that they like. But if you roll the dice with Ardbeg, if you roll the dice with something like Lagavulin, you just don't know. If they love smoke, by all means. Lagavulin 16, Talisker Sky, Talisker Storm, all delicious variants. They then break it down, add water, add their yeast, let it ferment. A couple of days, okay, usually you're looking at upwards of 65 hours to turn that mash, into your wash, into the thing that you're going to then distill. Pop it in the distill, twice distilled, it's still going to taste like grain. It's still going to have that grassy note. It's when it hits the barrel, that's when all the flavour comes in. As we go through each of these whiskies, where variation happens in flavour is intimately connected to what it's made from and what it's aged in. That's what whiskey is. A whiskey is a spirit made from grain that's been aged, generally in oak. I say generally because now there's all sorts of things, usherings happening in the background, people trying to push new styles and new flavours, experimenting as much as they can. It's all oak right now, but in 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, who knows? We're constantly evolving. When we get to the tastings of our whiskies, I'll start talking you through some of the flavours that you're going to be finding and some of those barrel interactions that you're going to taste. In Scotland, it's all American oak because there's no trees, there's no oak in Scotland. They cut it all down. They built ships out of it. There's a reason why the British Army had a great navy, because they just cut down all the oak and now there's nothing left. There's regeneration occurring, but that's why for so long you didn't have an English or a UK oak industry. And of course in America, you got heaps. Why? Because in America you can only use a barrel once. That's legislated. It was basically just a little bit of stimulating the economy after the Prohibition. They'll say, oh, it was to stop people using the wrong kind of ingredients. Flavouring whiskey with iodines and all sorts of different bits and pieces. But it was really just to stimulate the economy. I'll get to that a little bit later on. So in Scotland, they'll use all of those. In Scotland, they call them seasoned. In America, they call them used. Okay, so basically, whenever you hear seasoned oak, it's basically seen one fill in America first before being shipped across to the States, across the UK. What that creates, what brand new oak creates, is rich, intense flavours. In America, the reason why bourbons have such deep colour and such sweet, sweet flavour is not only because they're made from corn, predominantly, with a splash of rye here and there, depending on the distillery that you're talking about, but also because they've been aged in brand new oak that's been toasted. And when you toast a piece of oak, what you're effectively doing is you're caramelizing all of the different lignins, all of the different congeners, sugars, effectively, that sit in that piece of wood. And what you end up with is this wonderful, wonderful toasted smell which permeates through whatever particular hard spirit you put it in touch with. You're basically creating an infusion. Anyone made an infusion at home? Stuck a couple of Redskins in a bowl of vodka and then leave it under the fridge and leave it? Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. Don't tell whiskey distillers that. They shit themselves when I say that to them. They're like, it's much more complicated than that. Yeah, yes and no. Getting an understanding of it's not. You're putting a solvent in touch with something that's been charred, that's been caramelized. It's going to pull out all of that colour, all of that flavour. The longer you leave it in there, the more it's going to taste like that. And the softer, more mellow flavours are going to permeate through that liquid. Now in the States, because everything is brand new, it takes no time whatsoever to get that colour and flavour in. In fact, that's why they like it. You look at a bottle of bourbon on the shelf, between 3 and 4 years, sometimes even younger. But it still has richness, it still tastes delicious. It still has intensity to it. Why? Because of that activity of that oak. Once it's been used once, they send it across to Scotland, they'll steam clean it, and then they'll put grain whiskey in it. Grain whiskey is a bit similar, a bit different to single malt whiskey. It's not made using one of these. It's made using a large continuous still, sometimes twice the size of that pillar. It creates a light style and can be made from not only barley, but also wheat, corn, variety of different grains. That's the basis for our Johnnie Walker. That's the basis for your blended whiskies. It's often the reason why a lot of people sort of poo-poo blends. I think unfairly so. Who's a blend hater? Anyone just can't stand a blend, prefer to single malt? You can be honest, it's a room of love here, come on. Not one. My granddad hates blends. Hates blends. Not a massive fan, he just loves single malt because it's rich, it's the way God intended. I'm sure you've run into a few people that are like that and say, oh, don't talk to me about blended whiskey. I think it's a little bit unfair. A great blended whiskey is very much like a great symphony. You've got all these different little bits and pieces happening, different single malts that are playing their role, all held together by that grain whiskey. And the quality of your grain whiskey will create a delicious, delicious blend. We've got 2 blends tonight, Johnnie Walker and Dimple, both completely different in terms of their flavours. But I think certainly sit up there for me in terms of not only price point, but also flavour. So we're on to Scotch, we're on to grain whiskey, we're on to continuous. Any questions? Have I skipped through way too much stuff there? Is anyone just baffled? Shall we just taste some whiskey? Let's get on to it. What you've got in front of you is Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey is interesting because what we've got here is a combination of everything I just talked about happens at Crown Royal. You've got pot stills operating. You've got a coffee still operating, which is a little bit like a continuous still. You've got a variety of different grains that go into making this particular spirit. You've got corn. You've got a huge amount of rye. There's a little bit of a myth that all Canadian whiskies are rye whiskies. Anyone heard that one before? That definitely, it certainly sort of permeates, I guess, amongst the whiskey aficionados out there. Oh, Canadian Club must be rye. You know, Crown Royal must be rye. They do have rye content, and they do have spiciness, sometimes more spiciness than bourbons. But I find that they've all got a significant portion of corn in their mash bill. Now, I said mash bill there. That's a wrong term. Mash bill is bourbon. Mash bill is where you take all of your variety of your different grains and you mash them together to create your particular, combination of style. And if you Maker's Mark, you might have heaps of wheat, which is why it's sweet. If you're Bullet, for example, you might have heaps of rye, which is why it's spicy. It all gets mixed together, then it's stuck into a still, allowed to ferment and then distilled. Very similar to the old sort of moonshining ways, which has effectively been borrowed from. Canadian whisky is very different, because what actually happens is that they distill all of those grains separately. And because of that, it's a blender's paradise. What you end up with is just warehouses and warehouses and warehouses full of a variety of different whisky style, which you then use to create your particular representation. What we have here, okay, is a strong representation of that blended whisky style. In Scotland, when you talk about blends, they're multi-distilleries. They're from Talisker, they're from Singleton of Glen Ord, they're from Kalila, they're from Darwinning, all over Scotland. When it comes to this particular blend of whisky, all those different styles that contribute to the flavour are all from the one place, are all made on site. If you go to Gimli, I think it's called, I don't talk much about Canadian Club. I want to get the name right. Yeah, Gimli. It's right in the, on the west coast of Canada. Now, when you're normally talking about distilleries, they're generally close to city centres. This one's right out in the sticks. Gimli is basically a population of about 6,000 people. 75 are employed by the distillery alone. And that one facility creates all of the global volume, okay, for Crown Royal. 1.5 million litres comes out of that one little, 1.5 million barrels are on location, not 1.5 million litres. 1.5 million barrels are on location in that one spot. Let's all pick up the glass and have a little, is that one mine there, Michael? Yeah, easy. And have a little nose. Right off the bat, you'll be able to pick up the fact that it's sweet. I won't say right off the bat you can pick up the fact it's Canadian whisky. Of course not. Who goes, yeah, that's definitely whisky? Anyone?
I'll pick it as Crown Royal because I drink it a lot.
You drink it a lot? And why, what makes you drink it a lot?
I don't know, it's always gone well with dry.
Yes.
And yeah, it's just smooth and that sweetness because I'm mainly a bourbon drinker. So it's transitioning from bourbon towards
Absolutely.
the Scotch.
And that's a great, as soon as you said that, like, why do you drink it? Where do you drink it? Mix as well. It's got this lovely kind of hit of spice and maple. That's what I always find with Canadian whisky. Now, unlike bourbon, and this is again another one of those myths. Also, don't drink it all. I've got some pretzels I'm going to pair it with, which we're going to take out now as well. Just have one in your hand. I'll show you a little food pairing trick. You can also use 9.09% flavouring in Canadian whisky. That's why you can get all of these various different flavours that come out of Canada, which you don't get in the States. We've all seen it, like Crown Royal Maple, Crown Royal Salted Caramel, Canadian Club Apple. There's so many different varieties of styles. They can still call themselves Canadian whiskies because they're allowed to add that extra 9%. That's not suggesting everyone does though, because they don't. The main reason why Canadian whiskies will do that is for not only for interesting releases, but also tax breaks with the American market. Once you've got your pretzel, have a little bite of it. You'll get that salty sort of biscuitiness, and then just have a tiny little sip of your whiskey afterwards and see how it goes. We live in an Instagram and Facebook and content-heavy kind of world. And the more that you're able to offer a customer insofar as how they pair it with food, what potentially, what mixer to drink it with, how to turn it into a cocktail, how to, what beers to pair with it. We're in an age now where Boilermakers are becoming even more popular. Has anyone had a Boilermaker before? Beer and a whiskey side by side? Yeah, it's a great little experience. Why wouldn't they be fun? One's made from grain. The other one's made from grain as well. They've obviously got a heritage somewhere down the line. Have a little bit of a play around. Once you've got your biscuit, have a sip, see if it works. I love sweet and salty. It's a great thing to always pair with whiskey, salty food. Because what happens on your palate when you have that little bit of salt and you add that little bit of sweetness over the top is it pops the sweetness. Suddenly sort of makes it taste a little bit like, well, not taste like salted caramel, but it gives you that impression, of emphasising the sweet note. Now, a lot of people just see salty snacks as beer only. but that's not the case at all. You can really, really play around with it. The beautiful thing about it too is that they're mainly in store, or they're mainly down the road, you know, at your local convenience shop. They're very easy things to be able to pick up and to use. So I'm always pushing for stores to have things, you know, at the counter that you can actually go, yeah, try it with this beef jerky. It's delicious. Try it with this pretzel, you know, or this plain potato chips. Plain Kettle One, vodka on my brain. Plain kettle chips. Again, very, very simple, but works so well at elevating the flavours on your palate. So we're talking about why you know, that moment works so well. I used to drink a lot of Canadian whiskey. That was my gateway sort of drug. That was my gateway whiskey, if you like, into the whole sort of market of understanding spirits. That's what I was drinking when I was 18. And then when I wanted something a bit fancier when I turned 20, I started actually experimenting with on ice, and that led me into actually drinking it neat. Not straight away, but certainly eventually. So because it's sweet, because it's got easily accessible flavours on the palate, you know, I always suggest working with something like, you know, Crown Royal. Plus it looks nice. Look at it. It comes in a little purple bag. They've had this forever. I remember not my grandpa, one of my mates' fathers used to collect them. And he had them filled with all various knickknacks in his shed, like had bolts and all bits and pieces all built up. People have done all sorts of stuff with these. Turn them into car covers. Do you have any bottles of Crown Royal you got to drink to turn this into a car cover? That's an aggressive amount of Crown Royal. Why it's called Crown Royal? Started in 1939. Well, it didn't really start in 1939. There was a distillery owned by Sam Bronfman. He owned Seagram's. The King George V and his wife, Queen Victoria, were visiting Canada for the very first time. It was the first time a monarch had visited Canada. So there's huge amount of excitement. There was a huge thrill that was associated with the idea of finally we're being recognised. Finally, someone of such stature is visiting our little Commonwealth outpost. Similar to how Australia reacted in the very early days when we had, you know, kings everywhere. Suddenly there was a Queen Street, King Street, everything was changed. King William Street, boom, everything happened. As soon as a monarch came to town, as soon as the king, or let's say it's a king, came to town. So Sam basically created this particular whiskey, you know, to appeal to the masses that were activated by that experience. It was very, very clever marketing at that time. What's more important, he actually actively priced it above Canadian Club. He made it more expensive. And what does that do? People think it's better. Immediately. Premiumisation. Price point premiumisation. Back then, everyone thinks it's a modern term that came in with the super premium vodkas and gin and tonic. But it was happening, you know, not only then, but hundreds of years earlier than that as well. People want it because it's more expensive, and also because it's got that beautiful Crown Royal name. Very, very clever marketing by Sam, and it continues to be, I guess, an industry leader in Canada. The most consumed whiskey in Canada. And anyone who likes Canadian whiskey, anyone who's looking for a Canadian whiskey and hasn't tried Crown Royal, well, that's an easy sell. It's drunk by more Canadians than any other whiskey. That's got to say something. I like it in a lot of different ways. Yes, with dry. It makes great Manhattans. I know that you usually sort of call for bourbon, you know, or rye whiskey in those particular sort of styles of drinks, but you can still play around with Canadian whiskey as well. Anyone know how to make an old-fashioned? Great drink, sugar, bitters, bit of ice, boom. Again, it's at a price point that lets you be able to do that. Pick it up off the shelf and walk down to where you keep your Angostura bitters. Done. Nice little gift pack. A little bit of sugar, 60 mils, a couple of dash, stir it down with ice. One of the easiest drinks in the world. And with a Canadian whiskey, incredibly delicious. We're going to move past Canadian whiskey. Do we have any questions about it? So again, you take points from that. If someone comes in looking for a bourbon, I love bourbon. I'm really, really into it. But what else have you got? This is a great opening. The flavour is very, very similar, higher in rye than most bourbons. Most bourbons are higher in corn. This one a little bit spicier. Again, aged in the same way, aged in brand new American oak barrels. Not exclusively, like in the US, In Canada, you can keep using them. But again, to get that particular flavour, you're looking at that brand new hit of bright American oak to get that intensity.
I happen to know why Canadian Club 12-year-old went away from the unique model.
Why Canadian Club?
Yeah, the 12-year-old went away from that unique model. Still one on the shelf.
Why they went away from that particular bottle? No idea. No idea. If you find out, message me. I don't deal much with Canadian whiskey at all, to be honest, at all. I drink a little bit of it, as I said. It's sort of, I actually, to be fair, I have it much more with beer. So for me, it's I know that we're talking about RSA and responsible imbibing of alcohol. I have it with a shot of Canadian whiskey and then a beer. Not smashing the beer, but I'll have a shot and then I'll have a little sip of beer afterwards. Usually like a rye whiskey like Sierra Nevada works really, really well because you've got that spicy hit on the palate straight away. Awesome. Let's get into my passion, more so, is Scotch. Again, when we're dealing with the particular whiskey in front of you, heaps of people have their own impressions of Johnnie Walker. I guess I got into it because my dad drank it, to be honest. My granddad hated it. He's Scottish.
The Canadian Club ad.
Yeah, my dad drank it. Yeah, but it's true. I come from country Queensland, and that was all that was there. So I didn't really have a vast array of options. My dad also kept it he used to decant it into a crystal decanter. It was hilarious. So he was, would you like some Scotch whiskey? And it's like, yeah, it's just the cheap old 12-year-old whiskey, but he'd make it look real. He'd play it up, pour over some ice. It made it really fancy. The funny thing is, no one ever peeled him up on it. No one ever knew. He'd always be offended if they wanted to mix it with Coke. And of course, it's just Johnnie Walker Black. You can drink it the way you want. But he'd always play up to, you're going to ruin the flavour. Weirdly, I don't think he knew much about the flavour because I was drinking it for years, just topping it up with tea, and he just didn't have any idea what was going on. It was just, he thought it was getting better. Probably was for his palate. When it comes to Johnnie Walker, what I guess I get excited by, again, why it occurs is because of history. Okay, in the late 1700s, okay, as we're getting into the 1700s, the English are taxing the Scots like nothing you would have believed. Okay, the Scottish government is searching down illegal distillers in the Highlands of Scotland, trying to make them pay their dues. In the space of 10 years, if you had a little, and this little still isn't too dissimilar to some of the stills that would have been knocking around illegally in the Highlands. They basically started off as moonshiners, Highland moonshiners, using up a little bit of extra grain that they had left over that was about to sort of spoil. Turn it into a ferment, turn it into a beer, then distill it, trade it with your neighbour. Spirit was a great form of currency, just couldn't go off. Okay, so a lot of people made spirit. A lot of people did a very successful job at it. But because of the taxation on the volume of your still, what happened is it stopped the production in the Highlands. Suddenly everything shrunk. Because of these huge taxation laws, the quality of Scotch whisky, the quality of single malt whisky in Scotland plummeted. But there's still demand. People still want it. Enter blenders. Johnnie Walker wasn't the first, but he certainly was one of the most famous, okay, when it came to the styles of blends that he would have been knocking out at his little greengrocery store in Kilmarnock when he started in 1820. He was a reactionary. He was basically reacting to the economy around him. There was a desire to still drink whiskey. And the quality of whiskey was very questionable. So what blenders would do is they would take a variety of these different styles of single malt whiskies and blend out impurities. They would have started off with just single malts. So when you think about spirits that, I guess, represent that in your stores today, think of brands like Green Label. Just single malt whiskey, no grain whiskey. Monkey Shoulder. Anyone familiar with Monkey Shoulder? Again, just single malt whiskey. So again, when you have someone who comes in, I just want to drink a single malt. You try this. It's very interesting, especially with Green Label. It's like no other single malt you would have tried because it's got components from the islands. It's got components from the Highlands. Okay, it's got floral notes from Speyside and smoky notes from Islay. You're never going to get that in a single malt. Green label for me is an easy one. That's something that surprises single malt lovers how much they enjoy it, especially the price point for a 15-year-old whiskey. In the early days, Johnnie Walker would have been making whiskies pretty similar to that. As the company expanded, as he sort of put away all of the bits and pieces that he used to build his greengrocery business, started focusing on the whiskey, had a son called Alexander. He was actually the real brains. Johnny was obviously the founding father. He's the one on the bottle. Doesn't look much like a Victorian greengrocer though, does he, Johnnie Walker, in his top hat and tails. He's a very, very dandy-esque gentleman, much more akin to the world that Alexander Walker was stepping into. Suddenly started realising the value of marketing, transformed the brand into something that wasn't just going to appeal to his local market in Scotland, but a global market as well. That's when suddenly we start to see grain whiskey coming in and being involved. Produced on a mass scale, creating a very light style, drives down the price point, sell more volume. That's the beautiful thing about blended whiskey and why it became such a global phenomenon. Here in Australia, we didn't like Scotch was that. That was blends. Pretty much, if you went back 50 years ago, no single malts. They were brought in, smuggled in through duty free from trips overseas. Yeah, there might be one or two, sitting in some very, very expensive hotel bar, but it just wasn't seen. Those distilleries could barely source their own local demographics as opposed to start exporting. But when it comes down to a blend, you're only hampered by how much whiskey you can purchase. And that's why blends became so popular, not only in the United States, but also here in Australia as well. The whiskey that you've got in front of you is a variant on the Johnnie Walker Black Label. Started in 1909. Between 40 and 45 different single malt whiskies contribute to the flavour that is Johnnie Walker Black. Has it changed? Hell yes. All the time. Constantly. That's the beautiful thing about having a blend with 40 to 45 different single malts. You can tweak and change. You can manipulate flavour. You can ride the economies of scale. Suddenly, peated whiskey goes through the roof, as it has. Popularity soars. So you take out the peated whiskey that's the most expensive one and replace it with one that's more efficient to use. That's how blends work, and why the price point doesn't immediately start reacting like some single malt whiskies have. Or they just drop out of the market completely. We've seen a lot of that over the last 5 years, haven't we? Suddenly brands come in, brands fade out, non-age statement whiskies replacing aged whiskies. Heaps of volatility because of the popularity of whiskey. And somehow blends just coast along because that's what they're built for. They're built to survive that. Plus, I love the flavour. They are naturally lighter. Yes, if you love single malt whiskies, I'm never going to win you over to be a blend fan. If you just can't get enough of that texture, that flavour, that's fine. But for someone who's stepping into the industry, for someone who's interested in exploring not only whiskey for the very first time, but maybe Scotch whiskey for the very first time, blended whiskey I think is a great option because it steps you into those smoky characteristics. It steps you into understanding the rich and more rounded kind of flavours of the Highlands, the light floral flavours of the Lowlands. All those different locations in Scotland effectively have clusters of whiskey that taste the same. But don't get sucked into thinking that that's just what they are. Islay whiskey just isn't smoke. Yes, it's mainly smoke. Someone comes in and goes, can I get an Islay whiskey? They'll be disappointed if you give them a non-peated whiskey because that's generally what they're after. But it's not exclusively that. The same with the Highlands. The Highlands are mainly sort of, when you think about Highlands, think about fudge. Think about chocolate sauce. It's all rich and decadent. A little bit of fruitcake maybe dropped in there. Very little smoke, very little of the savoury stuff. These two, which we'll get into soon, are good representations of that yin and yang. So when it comes to blends, you've got a little bit more room to play. There's more flavours there to muck around with. And this particular Johnnie Walker showcases that. It has been finished in sherry barrels, or has a sherry influence. What that means is that a variety, not all, but a variety of the barrels that are used to blend these whiskies, okay, have been finished off in most likely Oloroso sherry. Oloroso sherry is the most popular sherry, you know, across the world. So you'll see the majority of these sherry barrels will be that style. And they're anything from 750 litre butts, you know, all the way down to sort of hogshead style, so 250 litres, and a lot in between. What happens is they'll age those whiskies separately at all the different facilities across Scotland that DIAGEO own, and then they'll be shipped to the one location and blended together. In some cases, there's large facilities as well where there's a lot of barrels on site, but a lot are often also kept off-site too. At any given time, Johnnie Walker has access to over 10.5 million barrels at any time that he can use. And that's constantly topping up, constantly topping up, constantly topping up, any day. That's currently fluctuating with how much they sell. I can't remember that. It's been a long time since I've said this figure, so you'll have to excuse me, but it's something like 234 bottles of Johnnie Walker across the range are sold across the planet every second. It's extraordinary. When I first heard that, because I was like, it can't be at 200 odd bottles. It has to be like, that has to be a minute. Has to be a minute. Nah, I was wrong. It's ridiculous. Huge volumes of spirit going out across the world, constantly being replaced by huge volumes of spirit. How we can achieve that? Through that grain whiskey. That allows you to create that constant consistency to the product. Let's all have a little nose of sorry, have I got any left? Oh, I love this one because it's something that I didn't actually work with that much. This is a brand new representation. Sherry right now is hot. Everyone wants sherry. Okay, mainly because you can't get it as much. It used to be everywhere. Go back 50 years ago, every whiskey is a sherry barrel finish. Why? Because my nana loved sherry. And so did all of her mates. And now no one drinks sherry. So of course, what happens to those barrel stocks? Plummet. And you end up with this sherry flavour as being kind of like a premium style today. Back then they didn't have huge amounts of bourbon barrels, not only because of Prohibition, which kind of sucked the life out of the bourbon industry, but it just wasn't a popular spirit. They weren't doing, you know, so many barrels that they had so much excess. Now, it's one of the most highest selling whiskies globally. So you've got that access. On the nose, how is it different to, say, the Crown Royal that you just sampled? What's the point of difference that you could potentially sort of suggest to a customer? More spice, more sweet, less sweet. I was going to say more sweet, but interesting because for me that super sticky almost, that Crown Royal, but definitely drier on the nose. But it still has like fruitiness. It still kind of has little representations of that sweetness. Whenever I'm trying to communicate flavours to customers, I always try not to get too personal. I do it sometimes. I can't help myself. I'm like, oh, it just reminds me of that, especially in big rooms of whiskey nerds, where I'll be like, oh, that one time I was picking mangoes on my dad's farm and all the juice ran into the tray and it got really hot and it just stunk. That's what it smells like. And everyone's looking at me going, great. What's that smell like? Again, I try and pick it at flavours that people really understand. At the same time, I try and stay away from just boring chat, boring language. You can make a sale so much quicker if you just take a second and don't say vanilla. Vanilla is one of the most vanilla words you could possibly say, especially to someone who loves whiskey. What's it smell like? Oh, it's vanilla. Doesn't mean anything. Vanilla is kind of like, well, great. It's still important because it does. All this stuff tastes like vanilla because that's the main lactone, that's the main flavour you're getting from oak. But this all doesn't taste the same. It all doesn't smell the same. So you should use different language as best you can. For example, when I'm looking at something like Johnny Walker, if I'm talking about Scotch, where it's got a little bit of faint peat smoke, that peat that I passed around earlier, there's a few whiskies that contribute to this that still have peatiness to it. Boom, burnt vanilla. You know, suddenly you're just adding a descriptor. You're adding something to it that just changes language. Caramel is the most boring description. Suddenly you put salted in front of it and everyone does a fucking backflip. It's everywhere. There's salted caramel whiskey now. Crown Royal does a salted caramel whiskey. You know how you make salted caramel whiskey? Just put salt in it. Done. But it's true. It's like when you use that language, make those descriptors. Vanilla custard is so much better than this vanilla because it puts someone there. It puts them in the room. If you go cinnamon dusted donuts with vanilla custard, they're having a great time with that whiskey immediately. And it's so much better than vanilla and caramel. So when you are tasting, just have a think, and when you are trying to explain it, have a think. You know, stop using the smoky. Okay, it is smoky. It's obviously smoky because it's an Islay whiskey. They probably know it's smoky because they're standing in front of the Islay section. Give it a description. It's like a wood smoker. Okay, boom, they're in a position. They're actually there. They're picking it up. They understand what that smoke smells like. You know, it's like charring steak on a barbecue. For me, that's what I get from Lagavulin. It's like charred, caramelizing meat. It's got a different kind of smokiness to it. So use that as a descriptor. I've gotten way off track, but sorry, I'm just going to... Sure. Perfect. And that is exactly right. Drinking a bonfire. I like it because I've used that. I've used little bits and pieces like that. Like I had this, it was a bit, it's a bit poetic, a bit florally. But at the same time, I was like, it reminded me of like kicking Lefroy because it's a bit coastal. It's like kicking a fire, you know, stomping on a fire on a beach on a wet day. You know, you get this ashy, smoky, sandy, wet kind of experience. Or being standing on the front of a ship, getting hit in the face with the sea spray. Now that for me is like Bowmore. They all have their little things that you can pick. And even if, you know, it is that little bit of extra sort of poetry, most of the time customers enjoy it, as long as you pick your customer. Old mate in the high vis, standing there looking for a bottle for his dad with a case of beer under his arm, gives no shits about that. He wants your direct answer to, what's this one that my dad's going to like? He doesn't want to hear about bonfires on beaches. He wants to go, this one right here, delicious, syrupy, buttery. Your dad will love it. Done. Boom. Off you go. Let's get into the taste. Obviously, you've all tried it. I've got to quickly pass around. I've almost forgot. Food pairing. Food pairing for this one. Can you... So who else wants that? There we go. Cherry ripes. Oh yeah, sorry. It's a recycled bag. I didn't go there. Look, see how old it is? It was in the back of the car. All right, it was in the back of the car. Anyone missing a? Anyone need a cherry ripe? Yep, here we go at the back. Oh, good, almost. Oh, one hand. Oh, so close. Anyone else? That's all for me. That's awesome. Yes.
What questions are they asking customers? What questions can we ask customers to understand if they would like to share a task?
What? Sure. It's a great question from the stream. Thank you very much, stream. I appreciate that. So, I guess when you're looking at how to understand how to sell this particular whiskey, a sherry cask finish, or any sherry cask finish whiskey. I know I'm here representing DIAGEO, but there's so many on the market that have got it quite plainly on the bottle. I always tend to ask, again, that question about smoke or no smoke, because that will generally move you towards sherry barrel finishes, which create fruity, almost like fruitcake sort of characteristics in the whiskey. as a general rule, those whiskies aren't peated. So that's a good start point. If they go, oh no, I'm not a massive fan of peat or smoke, okay, then we can head towards that category. It's a bit ironic because this particular whiskey here has a touch of smoke, only a very small amount, not a huge amount. It doesn't dominate the palate, but there's a little spiciness there. There's a little seasoning there. All Johnnie Walker products do in some way. So once you're in that category, once you're like, all right, no smoke, do you want kind of, honeyed, which is why I sort of signal for Highland? Do you want something sweet and honeyed, or do you want something bright and fruity? Fruity for me, as soon as they go, oh, what's fruity? That for me is sherry. Other examples like Singleton Spey Cascade or Singleton of Dufftown are good examples of DIAGEO whiskies that have got sherry influence. But there's examples all the way through Glenmorangie, Balvenie. They all represent this very, very particular Highland or Speyside style. Highland and Speyside, very, very similar in terms of the flavour characteristics that you'll find. Highland tends to be a little bit more. There'll be a few that aren't, but most of those whiskies are, like Glen whiskies are all Highland or Speyside, most of them. Glenmorangie is a good example. Awesome. What do we think of the Johnnie Walker sherry cask? Dry, bit different. I love it. I think it's a very different kind of whiskey. It opens up the blended category for me. There's so much chat on whiskey. I'm still a member of these whiskey forums. It's quite a sad thing. I just sit there and laugh. There's lots of really impassioned people on them. And whiskey nerds are going bonkers for this because it is that sherry cask finish, but in a slightly sort of different style. It's in a blended style, which not only makes the price point efficient for them, but it also kind of is starting to bring people back to the Johnnie Walker brand, which I love. I think it's definitely doing some pretty interesting things. Everyone know Double Black? Everyone, yeah. So this, if someone comes in and goes, love Double Black, have you tried the sherry? Because it's made in a very similar way. Double Black is all about the heavily charred casks. The sherry is all about using those casks that have been finished off in sherry barrels, or those whiskies that have been finished off in sherry barrels. So it's not too dissimilar. Very tight, very light. And that, again, because it's 12-year-old black label, there'll always be that contribution from Kalila, which is the signature smoky peat that goes in there. That's another really interesting thing when it comes to selling booze. Understanding one or two distilleries that contribute to the particular blends, because that way you get this lovely crossover. Kalila, for example, anyone heard of Kalila? It's a single malt whiskey. It very, very heavily contributes to Johnnie Walker. So does Talisker. Their whiskies go in that juice. And so when someone comes in who's a blend lover and goes, I love my Johnnie Walker, can't get enough of it. Like, have you tried Talisker? No, I'm not. Okay, it's one of the signature malts that goes into a lot of the Johnnie Walker products. Talisker smoke is what the smoke is in Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Really? Hell yes, let's get on board with that. So again, even just one or two of those signature, if someone stands in front of you, starts selling single malt, what blends do you contribute? Because it's always an easy way to get that crossover, and vice versa. Sometimes it's a little bit interesting. Single malt lover comes in and goes, love Talisker. Well, Johnnie Walker Blue Label, actually, that is Talisker smoke that you're tasting in there. Bit harder to go back the other way, but it's still an interesting journey. Let's get on to our next little whiskey, which is Dimple. Dimple's made a little bit differently. There was two competing families in Scotland that eventually merged. And when it comes to the Haig family, which effectively began the Dimple brand, especially in the back in the late 1800s, so 1893, they kicked off the Dimple brand. It was very much aimed at the American market. When it launched, there was this huge explosion of interest, from the Americas, drinking a slightly sort of sweeter, quite different style of blend. No smoke, for example. This was almost mimicking the kind of cognacs and brandies of the day. It was far, far richer in those sherry-influenced barrels. When we talk about Johnnie Walker Black Label, not so much the sherry, but certainly Black Label, it was all about sort of savoury peat character for me. How'd it go with the cherry ripe, by the way? Rock and roll. Again, it's just so simple. You know, cherry ripes are so accessible. I love things like bourbon and Bounty. You know, so like a good bourbon and coconut, again, works really well. I couldn't find them, but if you can find the dark chocolate versions, heaps better. Dark chocolate in any whiskey works really well because you remove the initial sweetness that chocolate, that milk chocolate brings, and dark chocolate has a slight bitterness, so it's further back on your palate. So when you're sipping whiskey, whiskey's very front, and it extends into the back. Okay, so when you have a little bite of chocolate or something that's a dark chocolate, you get that initial hit of sweetness, but it's all back palate. So it sits in the same place where the whiskey ends up, and that's where you create these wonderful kind of little discoveries of flavour. Dark chocolate M&Ms. Dark chocolate Maltesers with Johnny Walker is nuts. Of course, it's made from malt. Johnny Walker's made from malt. I discovered that in a cinema, which was, I won't tell you why I had the whiskey in there, but I discovered it. You know when you put the Maltesers in the popcorn, and I had like a hip flask, and it was great. Batman Begins, amazing. Fruit chocks. My wife, I can't get my head around. When I used to come to Adelaide, I'd come home, I'd have to take fruit chocks with her. Like for me, I haven't got into them yet. Is that bad? Like I'm kind of getting there. I have to persevere with it because it's really quite a special thing. I've not had it with the chocolate. Maybe it's the popcorn that'll get me in. Maybe the popcorn is the gateway. Awesome. So yeah, dark chocolate is always going to work really well. And again, simple things that you have in store that you can lean on very, very quickly, or something that people are always aware of. Peanut M&Ms is another great one with Canadian whiskey. Again, peanut butter, a little bit of maple, a little slight sort of sweetness. Happy days, works really easily. Onto the dimple. It used to be referred to as pinch. Anyone know why? It launched as pinch. Well, it was known as pinch in the United States. It was known as dimple in the UK. So because basically of how you pick it up the bottle. The main reason why it was that shape was very similar to Johnny Walker's shape. Why would you build a square bottle? Yep, straight away. Reduce breakages. Nothing to do with design. Of course, it had a massive effect on marketing and design. You got a square box, build a square bottle. Less bouncing around. Effectively quite similar with this. They would wedge these in and the structure would be very, very strong. You wouldn't have many breakages in transit, if any. And of course, that all helps your bottom line. That all helps your margin. Incredibly important when you're shipping something that's as valuable as whiskey, through the quite rough and ready transit routes of pre-prohibition America. The big thing with Dimple was it was all about that fruit and nut character. And I'm going to pass out a little bit of nutty chocolate. This is linked with some hazelnut. I love hazelnut. It's just, again, links in with Nutella, links in with chocolate, links in with whiskey. Again, it keeps on creating all those particular flavours. That fruit and nut character comes from the fact that, again, there is a small sherry influence in some of the whiskies that contribute to Dimple and have contributed to Dimple throughout their entirety. But the majority of those fruit characters come from the fact that they're not using big, smoky, Islay-style whiskies like Johnny Walker. That's the deviation. That's the point of difference on the shelf. Okay, that's what you're looking for. If someone comes in and goes, no, I'm just starting out in the industry, I've got this much money to spend, under $60, where are you taking me? This is still a very flexible whiskey for that price point. Okay, you've got something that is still able to be quaffed, you can still sip it, you can still add a dash of water, it'll still be quite complex, or you can really play around with it. For me, if someone comes in and they want a Japanese whiskey and they can't afford it, I sell them Dimple. Because most of the time, they've got no idea what they're looking for in a Japanese whiskey. They just heard it's good. Who's had those customers? I want a Japanese whiskey. Why? Japanese? Every time I did a whiskey fair, people would come up to me and go, do you sell any Japanese whiskey? I'm like, no, you drank it all. There's none left. There's industries going out of, they're going bust because of, they didn't have enough stock to survive the onslaught. Hibiki, anyone familiar with Hibiki? Gone. Prices go up, that much left. Again, like huge brands in Japan that are no longer able to sustain a global market. What people are looking for in Japanese whiskey is a Highland style. Japanese whiskey was created in the same genetic kind of makeup as a Highland whiskey. He studied under Ben Nevis. I forget his name. Who started Suntory? I always forget that. Doesn't matter. I'm going to call him, I think it's actually Mr. Yamakashi or something like that. I'm sorry. Yama. No, I'm not going to get it without sounding really horrible. I wanted to say Yamazaki. I really did, but I don't think, I think it's something, it could be along those lines. It's just skipped out of my brain. He studied at Ben Nevis. Ben Nevis, Highland Distillery. Married the distiller's daughter, good for him. Moved back to Japan, started Suntory. Okay, so again, had all of this knowledge, understanding of Highland whiskey style, which is what Japanese whiskey is. So that's just a little point there. If someone goes, what's a Japanese whiskey like on a shelf, you're directing them to brands like Dalwhinnie, brands like Glenmorangie, and blends like Dimple. On the nose, what do we get? Sell it to me. How is it different to the Johnny? You get rice. Brass. Sorry, I thought I said rice, and I was like, awesome. I don't, but that's great. Again, no one's wrong, by the way. That's the beautiful thing about tasting notes. You can go into any tasting with 100% confidence that what you get is what you get. You can't tell me what I'm tasting. You can't tell me that I'm wrong. You can tell me I'm weird. I've had someone go, baked beans. I'm like, okay. Not wrong, but definitely weird. So again, brass. I like that. So is there something sort of like a slightly metallic about it? Is that what you're sort of picking up? Yeah. Maybe like a brass cleaner or something that you might polish brass with. Something like an ethanol. It does have obviously a hit of alcohol there. Any other flavours? Someone said something earlier. Oh, who was it? Share it. Shinjiro Tori. I was miles away. But there you go. I'm not sure if that's the one I know. Maybe I was suggesting a different. I think there might have been. Yeah, I think definitely might have been a different one. And split. Lots of interesting stuff about that. And again, a good example where history denotes flavour. The whole Japanese industry started off the basis of one guy distilling in Scotland, borrowing that technology and taking it to Japan. All right, so for me, when I get Dimple, I get that absence of smoke. It's like I'm looking for smoke and it's not there. And what's replacing it are those really sort of soft, quite buttery sort of notes, of sort of like fresh vanilla. See that? Fresh vanilla. Ooh. Scraped vanilla. Ooh, even better. But never vanilla. So it's definitely a light style. It's a light style. How I like to serve this is a Japanese highball. Japanese highball, basically a double shot in a highball glass, topped up with sparkling mineral water. So it's like a Scotch and soda, but a very modern version of it. Again, super popular, but works so well with this particular variant because it's sweet and simple. Okay, it doesn't have huge, voluminous back palate like a single malt, but it's clean. What are some of the flavours on the palate?
Like a Cadbury fruit and nut bar.
Absolutely. So interesting you say that because what we should be pairing with it is Cadbury fruit and nut bars. You know how hard they are to find? They just don't, I don't know if they make them anymore. I went up and down the aisle over and over. I was like, it's just, no fruit today. It's just going to be nuts. But yeah, 100%. It's got those pops of dark fruits, sort of like currants or raisins, something that's a little bit more driven by that fruitcake style. It's almost sort of like moist and spongy. It's got a lovely sort of back palate to it. But it's also got that sort of darkness, that light, like earthiness that you'd associate with, like malt, effectively. It's still very, very present. Who's not like a whiskey drinker and could manage that? Yeah. Works really well on ice. as well. If you're looking at whiskies that perform really well, chilled, Dimple definitely does it. It becomes a little bit thicker, becomes a bit more syrupy. And I really love it out of the freezer as well. I know we always talk about Johnny Walker Gold Label out of the freezer. Dimple out of the freezer is another level. Say again?
I've never heard of whiskey out of the freezer.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But we're not shooting it either. I'm from Queensland, I put everything in the freezer. So again, it's one of those things that again, my dad used to do it a lot as well, was drink everything on ice. So I quite like the texture. What you lose, I don't like to drink a lot of single malts, obviously cold, because you lose a lot of aroma. But what you gain in terms of texture with this is lovely, because everything sort of thickens up. It highlights that sweetness. It just, again, when you're doing food pairings, when you're doing something that's a little bit interesting, again, just pops. A little bit of chocolate, frozen Dimple, easy. Absolutely easy. Any questions about Dimple? All right, let's get on to the real deal. Let's get on to my favourites. My favourites, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll give you these two here. Dalwhinnie is your classic example of Highland style. We've been talking a little bit about all these different regions around Scotland. Don't get too stressed about them. It's not like wine, and I'm being a bit controversial. It's not like wine where, say, someone comes in and goes, I would like a Barossa Shiraz. You go, great. Well, we understand why, the Barossa makes great Shiraz, because of the chalk, because of the climate, because of the temperature, all of the reasons why that location specifically creates a fabulous grape style that is used in that varietal. It's terroir. That doesn't really exist with whiskey today. It might have existed a couple of 100 years ago when the distillery was growing their own grass or growing their own barley, was using the water from the stream right next to the distillery, was effectively everything coming from that small little ecosystem, that financial sort of environment around the distillery. The barrels might have been made by a local cooper in town. Everything was local. That's simply not the case now with whiskey. But there are brands that are moving back towards that, and that's important to know. So Bruichladdich is a great example of a brand that's reinvesting in malting floors, returning to the old ways because they think that there's a lot of flavour that's being lost because of the modernisation of whiskey. So there is like that direction. Absolutely, premiumise. It used to be the fact that malting floors in distilleries were the place where you hide out for weddings because they were no longer being used. They were just big empty rooms, just like this, that would have, wooden floors that you would roll your barley out onto. And then the heat that would come up from beneath the boards where the peat was being burned would malt that grain. It's called a malting floor. That process is now done in large turbines, big drum malters, removing all the romance. Efficiencies, 24/7 distilleries. Little distilleries like Glenfiddich that, 100 years ago used to make that much whiskey and now, boom, can do that because of those technologies. And there's now a surge back. Has a little bit to do, obviously, with the growing craft movement. People like me making, small whiskies on small stills in small barrels for small amounts of people that are getting big traction. Those sorts of things are, people are inspired by it. And big brands, in particular, are subverting the way they do things. So bear in mind, that could change. Suddenly you might start seeing terroir becoming a more important thing with whiskies. The reason why a whiskey from the Highlands tastes buttery and chocolatey and dessert-driven is because of the style of whiskey that they've been making there for the last 120 years. They don't deviate much from that particular pattern. Why did it originally make it that way? Because you made pretty much what your neighbour made. You made very, very similar styles because you were sharing knowledge. When you look at the way that whiskey in Scotland has changed and subverted, it had a lot to do, obviously, with those technologies. The fact that peated whiskies are now only in the islands, really, had a lot to do with the fact that the mainland styles, again, upgraded their resources. They didn't need to use peat anymore. They could use something called a Saladin's box, which could dry grain using hot air. removed the need for it and promoted new flavours. Those new flavours, who were they making it for? Were they making it for customers? No. They were making it for blenders. It was big brands like Johnny Walker, big brands like Teachers, Grouse, Hague's, White Mackay, Bell's. I said Bell's already. Why they all became the real players of the day is they controlled flavour. They said, yes, I want that particular whiskey that you make, and you make it completely different to everyone else, so I need to buy all of it. And the distiller would be like, all of it? Like, all of it. Great way to make money. Why bother having to sell it by hand across all the different stores across the country when you could just sell it all to one person every year because you make the best? That's how a lot of these single malt distilleries that exist now got their start, was supplementing, you know, the ingredients list, if you like, of blenders of the day. Dalwhinnie is a great example of one of those whiskies that sits in the Diageo family. Bright in that Highland character. Honeyed is that perfect explanation that we heard earlier. So again, when you're looking at those Highland whiskies, they're the sort of dessert styles. And that's, for me, the easiest way to break it up. Don't get too stressed out, you know, Campbelltown and Lowlands and Highland. Yes, there's lots of different styles. For me, that I find the two that are the most important, the two that most people are chasing in store are no smoke, smoke. Smoke being Islay and the Islands, no smoke, Speyside, Highland and Lowland. The difference between Highland and Lowland, Highland slightly sweeter, Lowland slightly drier. The reasoning for that was that why that separation occurred, again, blenders. So the distilleries around Edinburgh and Glasgow, they were mainly supplementing to the big blending houses that were situated in those cities. So they made their styles as light as possible. So they would always be used. Because a blender wants that. A blender wants something that's light, that's easy to work with. They don't all want, I want the biggest, boldest, smokiest whiskey you can get. He might only use a tiny little amount of that. Can you see how the dynamics of flavour were changing because of what was the demand effectively for whiskey from those distillers, from those blenders, I should say? And Lowland's a good example of that. It doesn't taste like flowers and floral elements because there's lots of flowers in the Lowlands. I read that somewhere and I almost threw up in my mouth. I was like, people don't believe that. You can't say that it's because there's flowers in the Lowlands, it's a bit floral. The reason why it tastes like is not because of these amazing things, it's because that's the way they've been made for centuries. Well, not centuries, but at least over 120 years. With Dalwhinnie, Dalwhinnie was right in the middle of Scotland. If you were to throw a dart and hit the centre of Scotland, it's pretty much Dalwhinnie. It's the highest point in Scotland as well, in terms of distillery. There's no other distiller that's higher than this, about 375 metres above sea level. Not a huge amount. Scotland's pretty flat, but still pretty high up. Because of that height, it has a temperature of 6 degrees average throughout the year. I went there once. Should have known that, to be honest. Went there in like an outfit very similar to this. Nice little jumper, a blazer over the top was tweed, so I did fit in a little bit more. But still just tan pants. Got off the train to walk the kilometre, and then as I was getting on the train, two guys in full survival, like foil survival with the things, get on the train. They're like, all right, and I'm on, doors shut, I'm off, and I'm like, it's at least -10. This is fucking cold. But that's what happens in that location. Now, how that affects the whiskey is that this particular part of the still, the worm tubs, sits outside the building. So what happens is, because this vapour is coming down the lin arm, down into the worm tubs, it hits this part and it condenses immediately. What that does is it creates this kind of sulphury spiciness to the whiskey, okay, which again is what Dalwhinnie is really known for. Do your customers really care about that? No, but that's why it tastes spicy. That's why it's got this sort of slight sulphury note at the back palate. How do you communicate that? For me, again, you're talking about sort of like bush honeys, aromatic honeys. You know, not just saying honey, saying things that are actually active, like buttered honey on toast. Boom. You're still saying honey, but you're putting someone in a position where they're like, oh, that's exactly what I feel like right now. What were you going to say, mate? Sorry? Winter's Gold is a good example. So the question, sorry, I haven't been repeating the questions. What's the difference between this one here and Winter's Gold? Now, I don't like to just talk about price point, okay? Because price point, sorry, not price point, age. So this one's a 15-year-old, Winter's Gold, no age statement. And that's suddenly becoming a little bit of a difficult sort of conversation to have with people in store. I always often talk about the fact that it's levelling the playing field. We've never had age statements on Australian whiskies, ever. Why? Because Australian whiskies taste completely different to Scotch whiskies. An age statement is just... Including the Tasmanian ones. You've got some aged whiskies. Exactly, you've got some aged whiskies now because we've gotten to that point and a Hellier's 10-year-old tastes totally different to a Talisker 10. Yeah, again, because it's aging at a completely different rate. It's in smaller barrels. There's so much... Bullet 10-year-old tastes nothing like a 10-year-old Scotch whisky. So like age statements are becoming harder and harder to communicate to customers, to kind of use that as a pinpoint to understanding what a flavour is. Someone comes in and goes, oh, I like a 12-year-old whiskey. Well, you won't like a 12-year-old bourbon, and you sure as hell won't like a 12-year-old Australian whiskey, because they're all completely different kind of flavours. When it comes to sort of how you would communicate the difference between those two particular variants, I find that when you're talking about the Winter's Gold, it has that an intensity of spiciness to it that's accentuated by the fact that it is distilled at that point of the year. It's distilled in winter. And there's an even bigger intensity surrounding that actual distillation method. All year it's cold, but in winter in particular, that distillation happens much, much quicker, and it emphasises that spiciness. So for me, there's a richness and spiciness associated with Winter's Gold. It's still in the Dalwhinnie, but it's emphasised in that particular release. I love the Dalwhinnie because it is, for me, bang for the buck, right in the middle of what I think people want when they come in and they don't want smoke. They want something that's easy to drink, they want something that's easy to understand, and they also want something they've not really heard of. And for a lot of people, Dalwhinnie is that spirit. It's not this Glen like we were talking about before. Dalwhinnie is Gaelic for meeting place. Okay, and why it's called meeting place is it's actually situated between a few different hill clans, or where they would have been, not longer anymore. And it was the place where those clans would come down and trade. You know, trade their sheep and wool and daughters and all the things that you would trade in those. It's absolutely true. You know, swap them around and keep your neighbours happy. If you're married to the chief's daughter, it was what they did. Spreads it out a little bit. So yeah, it was basically a location which was replicated all around Scotland, but in this particular place, they wanted to be a representation on the bottle, if you like. I love the fact, so a few really simple sales points. Again, that altitude is important, and that altitude does change flavour. You know, that's why we've got Winter's Gold. You know, it enhances the spiciness. It enhances the intensity of the spirit. At the same time, there's no peat in here, but there is this soft kind of phenolic note. Phenolic is kind of like smokiness. It's not from peat, however. It is from that contribution that you get from the way it's being distilled. What's the alcohol content? 43. 43%. It's very oily, isn't it? It's got that lovely kind of buttery mouthfeel. And when it comes... And that, in a nutshell, is single malt. What you've just described there, the difference between a blend and a single malt, generally when we're talking about blends, they're consumed with mixers. They're consumed as a way of, you know, on ice with a splash of soda water. You know, as you go up, as you get older with you know, more wood contact, older age, this is a 15-year-old single malt. When we're looking at the Dalwhinnie, where is the Dalwhinnie? Oh, sorry, the dimple. Has anyone got the dimple? Still a 15-year-old spirit. Okay? But again, the main contribution of the spirit in here is grain whiskey, which has a different texture, a different mouthfeel to Well, again, that's certainly the grain whiskey sort of coming to play. The fact that this is all 100% single malt, so it's gone through that malting stage. It's gone through all those extra flavours, those extra techniques to create that extra price point as well. Let's not forget about that. Two 15-year-old whiskies, but very far apart in terms of where they sit on the shelf. Because of that extra contact with copper, because of the fact it's 100% malted barley, all of those flavours develop those particular textures that you're talking about. And those textures are brilliant. And if I'm selling whiskey, that's some of the first stuff I talk about. My mouth was salivating as you were describing it. You know, buttery, oily, viscosity, something that coats the palate. You know, those are great because everyone gets that. If I say, oh, it's got a real light honeyness, not everyone kind of gets that. They might be, oh, yeah, okay. You go honey on toast, you be, no. The way that Dalwhinnie develops, in particular Dalwhinnie develops, can you all get that little lick of heat towards the back? And it kind of just runs up the back of your throat a little bit. That's that sulphury note that I'm talking about. That's that attention to detail that happens in the single malt distillation where you get that influence towards the further back in your palate. It is a sipping whiskey. I want to pass around my favourite pairing with it. A few barflies floating around, but they're pretty harmless. This is a really nutty, gorgeous Gouda cheese from Cypress Grove in California. It is a delicious, delicious cheese. I'm so glad that the guys chipped in to get that cheese because it is a really, really good example of it. You have to go to like this I think it's the Smelly Cheese Shop in the Adelaide Central Markets to get it. It is an incredible, incredible whiskey. Incredible cheese, but it's an incredible whiskey pairing experience because of the way that those fatty flavours work with whiskey. When you want to do whiskey pairings, when you want to communicate that as well to your customers, the easiest foolproof ways of doing it, rich, fatty ingredients. They're always going to work because they've got such big mouthfeels. Cheese is a great example. Chocolate, again, you've got this rich heatiness, this creaminess that's associated with chocolate. And as you sort of develop, you can kind of find interesting variations on that as well. I love using things like flavoured butters in some sessions that work really well too. Like I've done pairings with steak at a steakhouse with different cuts of steak, very small little sections with different flavoured butters each time. Okay, like a porterhouse with a big bit of fat still attached to it, brushing it with anchovy butter. Okay, a slight fishy note, but it still creates this wonderful, oily, rich mouthfeel that the whiskey can play with. So that's the easiest way of getting people on. Do you like cheese? Do you like chocolate? You know, easy questions to answer. This goes incredibly well with X, Y, Z cheese. And all of those cheese pairings are in one location on the malts.com website. So I know specifically for us, all of the DIAGEO whiskies, you can go to malts.com and look at it, and they've got pairings for everything. They've got pairings with cheeses, with chocolates, with a whole variety of different particular malts.com, I'm pretty sure it is, unless it's changed. It's all. Is it right?
Oh, sorry, Simon Wilson kind of interrupted.
Oh no, that's all right. I haven't referred that website in ages. I hope it's still going because it was a really good resource. They might have changed it around, but I know that the DIAGEO Single Malts website has all those pairings on it because I used to use it quite regularly. It is all American oak. There's no sherry. Very, very little sherry used in barrels in Scotland today. There's a little bit, but it's mainly all your premium stuff because now sherry is such a premium liquid. And I can guarantee you, if there's a good whack of it, they'll tell you about it on the bottle. There's very few bottles now that are like, oh, there's sherry in this, but it doesn't say. Because it's such a premium finish these days, they're constantly using it as a way of selling it. Absolutely. Talisker uses a little bit of port. In fact, the entire Scotch whisky industry is awash with every different type of barrel that you could think of, especially today where flavour is king. Bordeaux barrels, you go through the distillers editions, you've got PX sherry barrels, you've got Oloroso, you've got Amoroso with Talisker. If you cross over to Glenmorangie, they were the ones that really wrote the book on sherry and sherry use. Balvenie uses rum barrels, in their rum casks. So there's so much playing around with flavour, all to I guess, create a point of difference, a premiumisation. How did that? Well, that's my favourite pairing. How did that go with the Dalwhinnie?
When I first had it without the cheese, I found it very boring.
Sure.
With the cheese, it just kind of
pops.
Like, wow.
Yeah, it pops. It makes it very, very different. When I used to do this, say, in store, I'd used to do this in BWS for VIPs or in Dan Murphy's for VIPs. That would sell bottles of whiskey immediately, because it was so easy. They'd be like, where do I get this from? How do I get this cheese? Obviously make sure it's pretty available. This stuff isn't as available, I'm sorry. It is still one of those harder ones, but I'm glad you got to try it because it is a delicious, delicious cheese varietal. Cypress Grove from, I reckon I'll get the actual cheese name for you. It's very, very special. I'd love to share it with you. Any other questions about Dalwhinnie? Stream. Non-age statement whiskies, do I have a one-liner? I guess for me, it's a hard one because it's a very divisive sort of field. A lot of the time, customers that will come to you, it'll take a lot to put them onto a non-age statement. For me, my one-liner is whiskey is always evolving. It's been evolving since day one. We're in it right now at a very, very volatile time where you're seeing more change than you've ever seen. But whiskey has always evolved, and right now we know more about putting flavour into whiskey, getting the most out of our ingredients. We understand more about barley use. We understand more about the science of yeast. We get more about different barrels and how they influence. We get more now today from the science of whiskey than we've ever known before. So we can now change up the way we make whiskies using a variety of different styles. My favourite non-age statement is the one we're about to taste now. So I'll talk a little bit more about that language as we go. I'm sure there's a guy back in a pub, in 1860 that was moaning about the fact that now all his whiskey's been aged in barrels. He can no longer get the bright Escobar that I used to have as a kid. Straight off the still, no mucking about, the way it was God's gift, the way it was supposed to be. I'm sure those guys existed. But whiskey was evolving. It went into barrels, it changed, it diversified, blends came about, prohibition came, dropped the industry. Suddenly it completely changed from sherry to bourbon after the rise of the bourbon barrels in the 40s and 50s. You could try a blend today from Johnny Walker and try one from 30 years ago, which I had the pleasure of doing at a place called Baxter Inn in Sydney. Totally different spirits, totally different. I mean, I could have not picked them as the same Johnny Walker. That's how much it's evolving. It's constantly, constantly changing. So that effectively, it's a pretty big one-liner. I guess whiskey's always evolving. And this is a representation of the science that's occurring today, for me. That's not going to win over everyone, but someone at the very beginning of their journey in whiskey, it's interesting. Flavour is king. And they're all flavour-driven styles. Talking about flavour-driven, onto our last whiskey of the night, which is our Talisker. And you need this. Or this is one of those ones which is... Any other questions in the room? Anything at all? While I struggle with this pourer? It's done. You might need a a little knife or something just to wedge under it. Yeah, I'll leave that with you. Sorry about that. Any other questions in the room about the Dalwhinnie or Highland style? So the difference with Speyside. So again, I'll just reiterate that again. This very, very much, I've got to stop pointing at Crown Royal. The Dalwhinnie, very much a great example of Highland. When you step into, say, Speyside, everything starts to become a little bit fruity. As we said, you get a little bit more influence from sherry barrels. One of my favourites, again, the Singleton of Dufftown. I'm not sure if you guys even range that. Do you guys range Singleton of Dufftown? Just about to? Right. For me, it's a great representation of sort of, there's this almost like a cookie dough, like macadamia nut kind of note to it, but at the same time has this wonderful kind of fruit base as well. And that fruit base has a lot to do with the sherry that's used in the maturation of that particular product. So all the way through Speyside, you get more of a smattering of those, quite intricate fortified wine style barrel styles, which sort of fruity, made it slightly fruitier. There are variations in the way that they make the spirit too. Some changes in the way that they do their malting, some changes in the way how long they ferment their product for. Lots of production elements that can enhance fruitiness, but that's the easiest one for customers to understand. Again, your customers are there for a couple of seconds really. When you hit them with sherry, when you hit them with fortified wine language, they understand it. If you go to the length of fermentation time, everyone kind of just zones out. Just like you guys did then. It's great. No, I'm kidding. 8? Whoa! In store? Oh, perfect. Glenmorangie? Absolutely. And that it's because what people love purchasing something they understand. When you kind of go, do you like port or do you like sherry or do you like, it's easy to get them into that sort of category if they've kind of got an idea about what they like first. Obviously, when it comes to tastings, it's really easy because liquid on lips sells bottles. We all know that. If you've got a taster and someone can taste it before they purchase it, they're 9 times out of 10 more likely you're going to buy that bottle of whiskey, especially if it's above $70, $80. That's always going to be something that makes it a bit easier. But if you don't have that luxury, find that one flavour that you can hammer home and hammer that home as hard as you can. If it's port, then again, start talking about those sort of sticky, drenched, dark fruits, those port flavours, dessert-driven flavours. If it's sherry, it's a bit brighter. Okay, it's a little bit more apricots and plums as opposed to sort of dark sort of raisins and sultanas that sort of port's more used with. Unless, of course, if it's Pedro Jimenez barrels, which exist with things like Lafroig, exists with things like Lagavulin Distiller's Edition, which again is just a decadent, sweet dessert style. On to my favourite non-age statement. I hate the non-age statement, NAS whiskies. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. Because immediately it makes the customer think that it's not aged. It's been aged. All whiskey in Scotland must be aged for a minimum of 3 years. If you've got whiskey on your shelf, it's aged. Doesn't matter if there's no age statement on it. With this particular whiskey, again, it comes down to the fact that it is flavour driven. On the nose, you will find that immediately. We just had one reaction straight away. You put this under your nose and it is bright, like green smoke. When you chuck something onto you might be burning off. Oh, that's a really country thing to say. When you might be like there's like a grass fire. Again, really country thing to say. I'm struggling now. If you have a campfire and you put something green on it and you get that immediate kind of vegetal smoke, you might be putting like rosemary onto a barbecue. You get that immediate kind of intensity of herbaceousness and smoke. That's, for me, is what I get with the Talisker. Smells like your clothes after sitting too close to a bonfire. I like that. Very, very, very close to that. Again, it's me kicking out. Again, for me, it's like kicking out campfires on beaches. Again, it's got that kind of connection between something salty and smoky, and that sort of intensity of smoke. The thing about age statements in whiskey the younger a whiskey is, the more you're going to taste the processes involved at the distillery. The older a whiskey is, the more you're going to taste the oak. So when you taste things like the Talisker Storm, which is a combination of younger and older whiskey working together, okay, what you end up with is this beautiful relationship between those bright flavours that you pick up from the distillery itself, and that's things like the smoke. That's things like the grassiness of that new make. I'll pass this around again and smell it against the nose of this. This is unaged spirit. All the flavour that's in here comes from the malt. There's no smoke, it's just that grassiness. And you can find that brightness and that greenness, you know, in these styles of whiskies. That smells a lot sweeter? Yeah.
Probably a lack of smoke as well.
Absolutely.
All that picture is sitting next to an open fire on a rainy night, drinking that.
And that's, see, again, that right there, can you just say that again a little bit louder?
So yeah, the name Storm, it just makes me want to be sitting next to an open fire, sipping on that while it's raining outside.
And that's
Yeah.
pretty much is spot on for what the branding monkeys at Talisker are probably aiming at. They're going, that's exactly the kind of imagery we want to create when someone picks up this bottle. And you're not wrong. All of the flavours, like when you come, has anyone had a chance to try some of the other Taliskers, maybe the Sky and the 10-year-old? What actually happens with the Storm is it's like a scale going up. Okay, so the Talisker Sky is a little bit lighter, it's a little bit brighter. It's like Skye, the Isle of Skye, which is where this particular whiskey is from, you know, in summer. It's not quite as scary. It's a little bit. It's a little bit sort of grassy. The sun's out. It's not too intense. Talisker 10-year-old. Okay, it's dialed up a little bit. The wind's picked up. The rain started. All right, classic Skye, classic Scotland. Storm is in the middle of winter. It's dialed up to 9. This is where you're getting more of those phenolic characters from the peak. They're using younger whiskey, and that youthful whiskey has brighter smoke character. Have you noticed when it comes to your whiskey shelf, the younger whiskies tend to all be smoky whiskies? Ardbeg 10, Talisker 10, Lefroy 10, 10, 10, 10. Everything else, Highlands 12, 15, 16. You know, it all is a little bit more barrel orientated. That's because Islay whiskies and island whiskies in particular, whiskies from the Isles of Scotland, are driven by that smoky flavour. They want that intensity. They don't want heaps of barrel impact. Okay, they want that smoke. They want that bright peatiness to be the shining force. Yes, you can get older representations of Talisker and Islay whiskies, of course. It's a business. But when it comes to their signature, the style that they hang their hat on, it's nearly always driven by distillery character over barrel influence. Does that make sense, what I've just said? That's why they're so intense. When it comes to this whiskey, for me, it's savoury. It still has sweetness, obviously. It still has sweet characteristics. I'm actually going to pair it tonight with some blue cheese. Did you try it with the blue cheese? Yes. Again, cracking. Why does it work? Tell me why it would work. Saltiness, the strong flavour of the cheese, and the creaminess. Creaminess is really important. The strong flavour stands up over the whiskey, and the salt heightens the whiskey flavour. Okay, so again, it's a perfect example. It's not always the first thing you lean towards when it comes to whiskey pairings. I was down at Dark Mofo. Anyone heard that down in Tassie? Awesome festival. And I was doing Talisker tastings, and I was doing blue cheese toasties with it. So it is like so cold outside. It's like the middle of winter. It's a celebration of the winter in Hobart. So everything is freezing, and people are coming into this warehouse, and they get that, and they get a blue cheese toasty. And people were falling over. Like, it was perfect in terms of that. So if you want to go home and have your own little, like, again, that conversation in front of a customer, everyone knows how to make a toasty. Everyone knows how to find a nice blue cheese. It might not be your thing. It still works with great cheeses as well.
Is that a specific brand?
That's Rockford.
Rockford?
Yeah, so Rockford is, it's up there. And why? It's just like good whiskey, good cheese. It really is, because what you get, you're talking about mouthfeel, you're talking about intensity of flavour. You're always going to find a slightly more balanced kind of experience with some of these more expensive cheeses because they've been aged, they've got more funk, they've got that more more bespoke kind of character because they're a little bit more smaller in terms of their production size. So when it comes to Talisker, a few other brand points. Again, it's the only, well, it's now no longer the only whiskey on the Isle of Skye. There's now 2 distilleries on the Isle of Skye, but it has been the only whiskey on the Isle of Skye all the way up to 2012, when another distillery was built and is now currently working towards its first release. Built in 1830 by 2 brothers. Now, ultimately, what Talisker really represents for me is the magic sort of nature of what Skye is all about. Has nothing to do with Gaelic language either. Talisker is very sharp and angular. You can always tell Gaelic because it's Dalwhinnie. Dalwhinnie and Glenmorangie, and they're all these beautiful rolling, sounds. They're like poetry. Talisker, it's really sharp. It's actually Norse. That meant land of stone. And that's pretty much what it is. It was one giant volcanic eruption that created not only Skye, but also Islay and a lot of the Scottish Hebrides. And that's why when you dig down anywhere in those locations, you get fields and fields and fields of peat, which is effectively a volcanic soil that's become waterlogged, okay, and has started to absorb that vegetation from around it. When it comes to Talisker, it's a very special whiskey. It gets people very excited. Like when I had a boss that actually named his dog Talisker, and it just every time it's this big. What are those big ones with the huge big wrinkles in it? It's like a Saint Bernard. It's massive. It was just like a sloppy big mess. Yes, it was just a big, just like lumbering beast, and it was perfect to represent that kind of brand. It is this beast of a spirit. It has spiciness. It's youthful and vibrant, but at the same time, it's complex and oily. It still has that wonderful mouthfeel that we want to find in single malt whiskies. The nuts and bolts of it, I'll tell you, because it's interesting to know, but you don't have to communicate that to customers. They're not interested, in that kind of why it tastes the way they want. They want to know how it tastes. Explain it to me, and that explanation before is as good as any flavour note I've read. It makes you want to sit down and crack it in front of a fireplace, especially once the winter kicks in. Try it with a blue cheese toastie. Perfect. How it's made. Okay, you take younger Talisker whiskey, so whiskey that's between the ages of probably somewhere around 5 to 10. Okay, there's much more bright distillery character there, and you blend with it older whiskey that sits above the age of 10. Not a huge amount, but enough to develop that back palate. What does old whiskey have lots of flavour of? Oak, barrel, vanillins. Okay, those soft, salty sort of caramel notes all come from that contact. So that's important. But they want brightness, they want the storm, and that comes from that youthful whiskey, that younger whiskey. It's delicious, yeah? Do you like it? It's a great example for me on a shelf of the way that we are better, we understand how to produce whiskey in more interesting and better ways today, I find. Everyone talks about, whiskey was so much better 10, 20, 30 years ago. And in many cases, it might have been. Certainly was a lot cheaper. Can't deny that. But is it necessarily better? I don't think so. I think where we're going today, our understanding of flavour, how we're able to really take everything that we've learned from a scientific perspective and put it in a bottle is totally changing. And you'll continue to see that. There'll be more of this non-age statement whiskey, because I think it's a really exciting and very interesting way of creating flavour in single malt that you've never had a chance to try previously. And that's another sales point. You've tried Talisker 10. Has anyone tried Lagavulin 8? Maybe, yeah. Again, younger representation. How is that different to 16? Totally different whiskies. Absolutely totally different. Because one is dominated by the oak in the 16-year-old, the other dominated by the smoke, which is the 8.
Yeah, I love smoky ones. I didn't actually rate the 8.
Didn't rate the 8?
I wasn't a big fan of it. Wasn't my
Yes. The funny thing is you have so much expectation because you drink so much 16, and then it's a totally different whiskey. You're like, I don't understand that.
It's not the right brand. The 8 is
You didn't like it? See, again, that's a really interesting, so where your palate is at, you can go, okay, cool. This is where my love of smoke is. This is the kind of intensity that I'm looking for. And I'm constantly shocked. I constantly say, start off with, do you like smoke? Do you not like smoke? I don't like smoke. I've put Lagavulin in people's faces before who don't actively say, nah, not a fan, and then try Lagavulin 16 and go, actually, I was wrong. This is delicious. So never write off somebody immediately, especially if you've got tastings there of some of those very incredible liquids. So what do we learn today, other than whiskey's delicious?
Cheese is delicious.
Cheese is delicious. For me, whiskey's about experiences. It's about creating those experiences, little experiences that people can access today that they understand. That's not too complicated. And that could be as simple as, cheese. It could be slightly more complicated with things like toasties. It could be even easier with things like a packet of nuts or a packet of chips or a packet of pretzels, with something like, Canadian whiskey and dry. Perfect. You're still creating experiences. You're still creating something that somebody will do every night to sit down and relax and switch off from the world. I know what I'm selling, and I do it every bloody night. Well, not every night. That would be dangerous. At least 3 times a week. It's always something in whiskey, something in this. It's always that lovely little combination. It's up to you guys to work out what's going to work best in your store, what you've got access to. Is it cherry ripes by the counter? Is it dark chocolate? Is it something slightly savoury? Are you within reach of, the closest Coles? Woolworths. Fuck, I knew I was going to say it. Every time. Woolworths. Sorry, stream, I'm swearing. I'll hear about that. That's the one thing someone will tell me. It's like, you always stuff up the Woolies or Coles bit. I've got to know it because I'm going to start selling to it as well. I end up, because then if you have stuff on your hands, people just stare, what's on his hand? I want to work it out. It's like Coles, Woolworths. So when it comes to work out what is in, if you are situated so close to your Woolworths, then make sure that you're shopping there so that you can send them across the road. I used to do that when I was at Dan Murphy's near the Wheat Sheaf in Sydney. It had a Coles, sorry, fuck you, they've got me now. Woolworths right next door to it. Drake's. Something else I discovered about Adelaide. It's just like, what is this? This is different. So again, the greatest shopping centre in the world. This is okay. Well done, South Australia. So find out what's in there, because that's an easy way of selling too. Find out the chocolate bars. Find out what's on special. Find out the cheeses. And again, actively sell through what's available. It's always an easy avenue to actually moving a bottle on the shelf. Understand the opportunities that you have within the non-smoky category. We had a great question from the stream. How do you sell a sherried whiskey? Start off by working out everything that's got smoke in it. Okay. Once that's all once that's all on one side of your shelf, and it's usually all in one location. It's usually sort of segmented into an area. You can kind of find those Speyside Highland styles that have got that fruit character that you might want. Fruit, chocolate. Easy. Highland styles. Again, playing around with honeyed characters, chocolatey characters, desserty, fudgy characters. Another easy one to be able to kind of direct people towards. And then your crossovers. Those crossovers I was talking about before. Crown Royal, getting bourbon drinkers on board with Canadian whiskey. Understanding the single malts that go on a Johnny Walker, like Talisker. Getting a blender, getting someone on blends to maybe experience single malts for the first time. Maybe experience drinking neat whiskey for the first time. Through some of their favourite flavours that they already understand. They're all very, very simple, but at the same time require an extra effort. And that extra effort begins when you're in store just reading the back of a bottle. I'm sure you do a lot of that. Polishing, cleaning, stacking, shelf. All that requires an awful lot of work and maintenance, but at the same time, it doesn't take much to have a quick squiz on the back, because that's how I pretty much picked up everything when it comes to the whiskies that I work with. Reading the back of the bottle, having a little brief look online, always good things. A few resources to look at. Malts.com, check it out. All those pairings I was talking about all came from there. So it's a great resource. A really good one is scotchwhiskey.com. Okay, ScotchWhisky.com is run by a guy called Dave Broom. I'm not sure if you know Dave. He's a very, very influential whiskey writer, and he set out to create just pretty much an overwhelming resource for people like you who are selling it constantly, who are looking it up constantly. It has something called Whiskipedia. Use that device, because it will give you information at your fingertips regarding anything on your shelf like that. It is so up to date it scares me. It's a very, very good device for if you're on your phone, on a break, you've got something new on the shelf, you want to read up on it, it's so new that you haven't even got the details of it in the shelf yet, it'll be on scotchwhisky.com. So it's one of those very, very, I'm not getting paid by them, I do contribute. But at the same time, I don't get paid to say that. It is a very, very good resource. Any questions? Say again?
There's a lot of new stuff on it, stuff I haven't seen.
Yeah, it's straight out of the horse's mouth in terms of what's happening in Scotland. It's a very, very good website to follow. Any other questions in the room about some of the stuff I've talked about? Anything that I didn't miss, which is really obvious that I'm potentially going to hear about tomorrow? Woolworths? Every time. Guys, thank you so much. It's awesome to roll out a bit of whiskey chat again. Very, very quickly, I've got to do it just so you know what you're looking at when you see it. I'm pretty clever like this. This is, it's always going to be the second one, isn't it? This is the gin. So you'll see this in some of your stores. I make it with two other guys out in Royal Park. Just like me, it is rich and over the top. No, I wish. We wanted to create a gin style that was very fragrant, that was a very classic style. Lots of juniper character. So not as much natives, we've gone a different direction. We wanted to do something that appealed to, I guess, classic gin drinkers. Absolutely. It's not part of this session, but I will leave it up here if you want to come and taste it. It will be in store in some stores in the next couple of weeks / days. So we will be getting into all of your stores as well. I'm very passionate about being in store. Where I pick up a lot of the stuff at Whisky was being in store and selling with you guys, and I understand the value of being able to, I guess, pour spirit